There we go. First of all, I want to say just a few things about why I shouldn't be here. And so I want to say some things against psychoanalysis. This is the real dirt, you see. And I want to say a few things against postmodern thought. And I think I'll start with postmodern thought. I'm just going to assert things, really, without proof. So I find it difficult to believe that everything is shifting sound. Everything is not shifting sound. There are real entities that can be named and identified, and we exist in a real world of bodies. And biology does constrain and define us, as does the real world of culture and human relationships, not infinitely plastic or negotiable. So I believe that language carves the world to an extent at natural joints, that it communicates by common meanings which are not individually negotiable. And this means that there are lesbian identities, that just are, and they have commonalities that arise from biology, psychology and culture. Why is that important? Well, because I think that postmodernism tends to destroy the transcendent function of the imagination by threatening to cut away all the structure that it seeks to transcend. And that's important to me because I'm interested in the imagination and the power of the imagination. What about psychoanalysis? Well, I'm sorry.
You're so not.
I'm sorry. I'm afraid it's done a lot of bad things. As far as I can see, there's no evidence that it works, but the therapist is making an implicit claim that they're going to be doing something effective. And actually, as far as I can see, the efficacy of therapy I have had and the therapy I've given has been inversely and directly inversely proportional to analytic purity. And I think it can amount to obtaining money by deception. Now, how do I get to that rather difficult position? Well, I started out by thinking about the difference between good and bad homosexuals, which I wrote about in a paper on prejudice. And it then occurred to me, this is to do with the imagination, that I was far more interested in the details of sexual acts than I was in the quality of the relatedness to the people involved, and that the two things matter about as much as each other. So I looked at fisting for a while. Then for some relief, I thought a bit about friendship, and it seemed to me that lesbian erotic experience is conditioned by lesbian social experience, and that was what I took up in a paper on friendships. And trying to tie all that together, I looked at the therapeutic potential of the imagination, and particularly of the erotic imagination, in a book which I notice isn't on sale, so you can't buy a copy, called Sexuality, a Biopsychosocial Approach. But where I've come to really most recently is almost, not quite, almost to the position that aesthetics is an end in itself. And I want to quote to you something just come back to me throughout my life. It's an interview between Russell Harty and Salvador Dali. Nobody thinks of Russell Harty anymore and the terrible, terrible way he died. And very few people think Salvador Dali. But anyway, they were both swimming. And Russell Harty said to Salvador Dali, well, what's your favourite animal, Salvador? And he said, rhinoceros! Because he spoke like that. And so Russell Harty, playing the straight man, said, why? And Salvador said, the divine crenellations. And I suppose that's what I really think. It's about exploring the divine crenellations. That's where we're really going. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the biopsychosocial approach. Then I'm going to say a few things about the imagination. I'm not going to critique psychoanalysis and the imagination. I feel you'll just cut me down in flames and it'll be very unpleasant. So I'm just going to move on quickly to talk about the erotic imagination. And then as fast as we possibly can, we'll look at some pictures. Gets less controversial as we move on. So first of all, the biopsychosocial approach is very boring, but it's terribly important. It simply is a special commitment to valuing the contributions of biology, psychology and culture. And it just says it'll go wrong if you neglect one of those. And the tendency is always to leave one out. By holding the three in mind and considering their interactions, you can go a long way, and you get drawn back from making a lot of mistakes. What's the imagination? Well, the ancients just thought of the imagination as the ability to conceive of things not present before the senses. But of course it was taken further by Coleridge as the actively synthetic and creative capacity of the mind. Warnock, whose very good book on the imagination is a heavy read, but it's a good book, talks about it being a link between the momentary and the permanent, fueled both by memory and desire, and that's my little anti-Bion kick here. Both vitally important to be brought into session as much as possible, at every possible moment, to be chock full of memory and desire every session. But actually what I really like is Danto's definition in his superb book, Transforming the Commonplace. Just that's what imagination is. It is the capacity to transform the commonplace. Well, as I say, I'm not going to tell you about this, so you'll just have to imagine it. What about the erotic imagination? Well, again, just to think a bit about what the erotic imagination might be. It's all those imaginative capacities or activities concerned with sexuality. So daydreams, sudden attractions, smutty talk like this one, experiences of moral or sexual horror, fantasies during or about sex. And of course it's got a social dimension. Smutty jokes, women draped over motor cars, or a sudden upsurge of social rage over a paedophile scandal, hunt them down type stuff. Those are all works of the erotic imagination. They're not all by any means all that desirable. Now I want to highlight the work of Isay, who's I think very interesting because of his idea that you are homosexual but you become gay. And this is, to my mind, an example of how we might fuse the biopsychosocial approach with a focus on the imagination. So if you'll forgive this rather heavy slide, I'm using homosexual orientation here as an example, a whole range of ways in which one might do this fusion, that a biologically based predisposition to object choice fuses with a predefined set of social role patterns which predefine both various different kinds of heterosexual and homosexual relationships. But here's the important thing, in a psychological work of the erotic imagination, which produces an evolving imaginative identity. And so one might be born homosexual but become a lesbian. And that's an example of how the imagination pulls through from biology and culture to make a personal psychological work. See, the thing is, I was trained by Jungians and I have to keep reinventing it. Well, what are common constructions of the lesbian imagination? Well, the first thing, we can't get away from the fact, and I took Bernard to be saying something of this, lesbian identity, gay identity is always to an extent an oppressed identity. And that's its pain and its pleasure. That gives some people in this room a kind of shared commonality of being amongst friends, but it also makes it sometimes a bit cliquey. Then the next thing I'm very interested for a long time by dildos, which I suspect were more theorised than wielded, owing to their cab. It's all his fault, really. Then there's a whole scene in the literature about merger, which is the idea that girls are supposed to be more permeable to boundaries than boys, and so they're merging. And this idea is very, very clear, very similar to the idea of the lesbian erotic imagination, sort of languid or anxiously deficient, which is often portrayed in heterosexual literature. That Scruton portrays it in that way. Then, of course, there's been a whole dialogue about butch femme, radical alternative or sexist sellout. So those are the kinds of sort of brief smorgasbord, the kinds of forms or moulds of the imagination that we might have. Now, I could say heavy things about photos and consent, everything like that. I could tell you where all the pictures come from. Bother. I'll have to find them out. So some of them are very famous. Okay. I'm just going to make you look at the pictures now. So this is really a Cook's tour. Okay. There's no point. There's no end. This is just the divine crenellations that interested me when I'm looking at it. So I'm just going to show you lesbian pictures and talk about them. And there's going to be, as it were, no point to this, because all we're doing is driving over that line. Once you start, just calm it down. But first of all, I want to talk about lesbian pictures and lesbian erotic pictures and the idea of the mirror of nature. The femininity is traditionally linked with nature, and lesbian identity can therefore be coded as either natural or unnatural. And in this series of pictures, you can see lesbian identity coded against the mirror of nature. Here revealed as plenty, a romantic scene with the pouring out of water, and a particular kind of gender play. This is a particular kind of romantic image, the Lord and his lady, or the Lord and her lady in this case. Set against this image, where the sexuality is only really discernible by the title and the location of the image. It's a picture published on a website called butchfemme.com. I recommend visit. It's a lot of good art on that website. Okay, so that's or this one. Again, from that same website, beautiful picture, I think talking about longing and the use of reflection, because nature here is reflected in the image of the house. Okay. And also it's an image that speaks to lesbian identity in the life cycle. I like this picture. I know it's an important picture. And I thought it was also important to mark it as an erotic picture. And then just to finish off this section, a very famous image. There's a pun there on the reference to fish. It's nature referring to a sexual relationship and sexuality. So let's let you look at that picture for a minute. And compare it with a younger image, which I particularly like, and I think secretly want to hand out to all my patients who hurt themselves. So here is the body coded as ultimately natural, but it's also a lesbian maintenance manual, isn't it, with an instruction set. And it's very interesting that, because there are similarities between this picture and the tensions within it, and the sex manuals for heterosexuals produced in the 1920s, both coded female sexuality as natural, but also encouraged men to think of their women as musical instruments, had to be played very carefully, bring the nature out. Very interesting. Now this next section is about nipples, which are obviously important. There as well. I'm suggesting here that the contentious point of nipples might be more important to lesbians, or breasts are more important to men, but maybe not. So here's one where no nipples are present. Very famous, again, famous image, important image. And the nipples here mark out the boundary of a revealable décolletage, don't they? And they stand proxy for the beginning of a serious sexual encounter. The tongue here is standing, if you like, for the nipple. Okay? But the tongue and finger placement in the hands of the models also refer to that terribly charming kneading that babies do at the breast. So there's also a link back to childhood. But here, just so there's one toilet breast. Here's the breast with a loo handle. But also standing proxy in the image of the photograph, the breast is standing proxy for the genitals, because it's very difficult to reveal genitals in photographs, and so you have to have things that code for it, signalling what the camera doesn't reveal. Again, another very very famous image. Some people, you notice that the loo is also standing proxy at the bottom. It's a very very beautifully composed image. And then this one here, some people find difficult to look at. Okay, the erotic value of nipple clamps is probably in my view dependent on pain thresholds, certainly not something I've ever been able to handle. But symbolically though, I think they mark a need for the breast not just to be milk outlets. I actually think the nipples are being clamped off here. And I'm quite interested in the erotic value of the non-productive breast. Now that brings me on, well certainly since it distresses me that slightly, that image, it brings me on to images of erotic distress, and those are well imaged in lesbian erotic photographs. And erotic distress is signalled often by the use of multiple disparate elements, not well or harmoniously fused into the image. So here's I think a very beautiful photograph that comes from the days before it was easy to produce this kind of image with digital photography. This is all put together very very carefully, and any mistake would have required the whole image to be redone, I think. It's a very very complex compound image called Jealousy. And it signals an interior state, beautifully signals an interior state with overpainted elements, We're never quite sure whether we're looking at pubic hair or head hair or a rumpled bed. We're certainly looking at the interior of somebody's mind in some degree of sexual turmoil. And then this image, a German photographer produced this image, which I think is also very, very haunting, very arresting, which again manages to unite a whole range of disparate elements, but in a much more unified image, a fetal element here, but also the image, I think, probably of a concentration camp victim, merged up with a yin-yang symbol, and also the idea of a waste pipe or culvert in which one might suffocate. You could go on looking at this image, you could see that as a penis, inside which there's a sperm, you can see it as a womb, inside which there's a baby. You go on and on and on, being drawn into that. It's a very, very simple image. And then I wanted to put in this image, again from that website with its very good art. This is a painting, it's the only painting I'm going to show you. It's a classic pose for a nude, but there's a slightly odd angle. If you notice that there are systematic distortions in the image. And the jagged and blurred way in which the image is presented shows that there's been considerable work done on it by the painter. And this is portraying distressed state. So the imagination is trying here to work over and think about the distressed state. And the image comes with its text. My girlfriend at the time and I had an argument, and she went to bed angry. I drew this originally in charcoal and painted it much later. So that's about how someone could hold something in their mind and work it over, turn it into an image, was then important. And we think about why there's then even more important to display that image publicly, and what the public display of that image did for its originator. I wanted to put in just one picture about pregnancy, because of course the erotics of pregnancy come into lesbian life now that more and more lesbians are having babies within lesbian relationships. That's what I mean when I talk about changing meaning of pregnancy for lesbians over the decades. And this very beautiful picture, which plays with gender in very unexpected ways. The pregnant one has very butch arms, if you notice. But the non-pregnant one is stretched back in such a way that her breasts are de-emphasized, so that makes her figure a bit more androgynous. And you notice that the way in which the image is presented, there's no pubic or arm hair that's visible, but the head hair is coded as feminine. So this brings into mind quite a lot of the work, I think, photographic work of Mapplethorpe, who looks at very, very complicated ways of coding male and female gender in a picture. I think this picture shares an erotic is trying to represent a shared erotic understanding of pregnancy that both women are moving towards. Now this next sequence I've called Enticement, another quite well-known image, which I think talks about masturbation really, the self-absorption of the model, and her way of touching her tongue, the tip, the most sensitive to sweet, with an ostentatious closed display. But of course, to be able to masturbate in front of another person requires a very considerable degree of self-absorption and trust, and that's why it's enticing. And contrast that with a much more mainstream image, with a lot of female fetish imagery in it. I won't draw out for you all the possible thoughts that you could have about eyes and laces, about the contrast between an adult pose and a very, very childhood name of the image, peekaboo, and the childhood coding of the face with the wide-set, very large eyes that are made up to look even larger. Well, no talk in this setting will be complete without objects. So here's some part objects for you to relate to. This is a picture by Phyllis Christopher called The Sexy Stuff. I'm not going to say a lot about it, except that it does seem to me to be about to say something new and different about part objects, or we haven't been able to say ourselves in psychoanalytic discourse. Here's another one, which is a beginning to play with stereotypes of female imagery. This is called Blonde Hanger. And it's quite interesting. It's an image right on the edge of what one could think of as a lesbian image. image. It's certainly playing with stereotypes of female imagery, the enlarged breasts and the way in which the woman is hung up with shaven armpits and ambiguous pubis. And just to end this little section on objects, here's some real pornography, just in case you've been forgetting what real pornography looks like. Okay, notice that the two models, neither of them stare at each other or absorb each other, they're looking at a third, always thought of as a man actually. Okay. Notice also that there are some very strange objects scattered around on the floor of by the encounter. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to work out what they are. anyone can fantasize. Well, I'm just going to skip you through some of these pictures which you've seen again, because I wanted to bring us from objects back to a whole range of images which are all about couples. It shows the enormous diversity of beautiful, particularly this one, beautiful images of couples. Okay, and to contrast that for you for a second with this image, which is all the straight world will provide us with. And that's to bring me on to think about poverty of the imagination, the ways in which a therapy session might attend to the imagination and might think of the enrichment and the enlargement of the imagination as being a more important aid than other therapy ones. But I just couldn't end my talk without just one really serious joke, so here it is. I just couldn't leave that one out. I couldn't think of it. I knew you'd want to see it.
Thank you very much. Great.
I wanted to say that I really appreciated your opening with the sort of grounding between the postmodern, the shifting of sands kind of thing, and grounding it in some things that seem to be just real. But my comment is that your presentation seemed very postmodern, and I thought that was kind of interesting. That's it.
Yeah, I'm not sure to say that. You see, what I'm trying to argue against is the idea that everything is negotiable. It seems to me that it's an tension between what you can and can't negotiate, that you get the space to make things, or to create things, or to develop something new. And the idea that everything is plastic, or everything can be bent around, or that all meanings are shifting and multiple, tends in my view to destroy that tension, destroy the relationship. And it goes for me it's even more important than that, you see, because I think that the fact that there's no empirical support for psychoanalytic psychotherapist effectiveness is people say, oh yeah, come on, Chaz. But actually it's about some other way of interrogating the process against which that process would have to grind or bump up, that makes for a reciprocal. Now, it might not be experimental data, and that happens to be where I come from, but it might be experimental data, but any kind of process which allows a real interrogation of what you're doing, as opposed to just, oh yes, all that confirms what I thought already. And it's very easy to pretend that one is really interrogating what one's doing. But if you're making something, if you're using a material substance, then either it breaks in the kiln or it doesn't. And that's very helpful, I think, to imaginative work.
Okay, well let's just pause it there then. Thank you very much.